All right. Hey, everybody. Mr. Shea here. Happy, glorious, sunny day. As always, homework videos are brought to you by tea. It is so nice. It is so warm. It is tea. Thanks, leaves. All right. Turning point number one, the election of 1896. So, my students, we are breaking down this year into a number of turning points where America dramatically changes. So, the first one we're looking at here is the election of 1896. And this is generally regarded as one of the biggest elections in American history because, in many ways, it was a crossroads of what America saw for itself, which I think sometimes we feel like every election is, and it is certainly a chance for the voters to see what vision they have, but this one in particular is a big one. So, why? Why was it a big election? Great question. Let's find out. So, before the election of 1896, we should step back a little bit. My students last year obviously was a bit odd, so I'm not quite sure how far you got in your first American history class. But after the Civil War, we have Reconstruction, where the devastation caused by the civil conflict, America is rebuilding and trying to put itself back together. And in that Reconstruction, we have freed slaves who are also trying to figure out their way in a nation which now no longer considers them property. So we have a big change socially in the country. And Frederick Douglass has a great quote, which I will read to you right now, that he was a bit worried that the peace might not be the greatest thing. And that quote is right here. If war among the whites brought peace and liberty to blacks, what will peace among the whites bring? And Frederick Douglass had this apprehension that the peace that would result in the country would, in fact, have negative results for African Americans. And he was correct. It very much did. So we have this Reconstruction that's going on. We have the Second Industrial Revolution happening simultaneously. And a lot of the factories that had initially cropped up around the New England area because they were able to be fed by and powered by rivers. If you can hear in the background, there's some blue jays just being annoying. The Second Industrial Revolution really doesn't help the South. The South remains predominantly agricultural, whereas a lot of these factories are occurring in the North and the Midwest. With the growth of these factories, it's important to note that there's a lot that's needed to build these factories, namely workers. And since these factories required so many workers, we do start seeing the growth of cities far more quickly than they had been growing in the past. So factories are growing cities, cities are growing the population, and with all of these workers, with all of these people, there's a lot of money that is coming and being created in the United States. Certainly, the majority of people in the United States are not very wealthy, but there are a few that are. I mean, in today's money, we have people like this. This is Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Steel. So all of the bridges, the skyscrapers, these buildings and projects around America that require steel is giving money to Carnegie. We have Rockefeller, we have Ford, we have these huge figures in American history that in today's money, I mean, they'd be worth $200-300 billion, which is far more than the people that we have today. So it's what's known as Mark Twain calls it the Gilded Age, where you have this shine, this golden sheen that's across America with people like Carnegie, with these new buildings and structures that are being built. But under the surface, it's actually pretty rotten. It's pretty poor. The people themselves are struggling. And it doesn't help that in 1893, there's a panic. There's a financial depression where there's a lot of fear. There's unemployment that results. And in fact, here we have the Commonweal Army that this is the first March on Washington that we see in the United States of unemployed people marching and saying, we need help, government, you must help us. So leading into this election, we have a lot of anxiety. We have a lot of turmoil going on in the United States. And it isn't just workers who are unemployed, but a lot of the farmers out west are in debt. And the financial panic caused these farmers who had borrowed for machines and for land to not be able to pay back their loans as easily. And the farmers aren't just the ones worried. The people that aren't employed, they're worried about their jobs. They're worried about immigration. And a lot of these factories are recruiting immigrants. So we have not only in the East with these factories being staffed by immigrants, but in the West, particularly, we have immigrants that had been coming in since the gold rush, particularly Chinese immigrants who had stayed, and it was mostly Chinese males that would come over and work in a lot of low-wage jobs like laundries, working on the railroads when those were being built. And a lot of the pushback to this was, especially in the West, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is signed in 1882, extended in 1892, to protect a lot of the Americans who see that immigrants are a threat, that they're an invasion. And these are words that we hear today, and these were the same words that were being said back in the 1890s. So to protect Americans, particularly one law was passed. Here's a political cartoon that is displaying the plight of the Chinese in regards to the United States. This golden gate of liberty is closed to them. At the bottom, we have this enlightened American statesman, we must draw the line somewhere, you know. So you have a racist policy of Americans saying, we can kind of hold some immigrants in this country, but not all of them, and definitely not Chinese immigrants. And certainly this isn't everyone in the United States. This isn't everyone saying that. Massachusetts senators voted against the Chinese Exclusion Act. So certainly while we talk about laws that do get passed in the United States, remember, it's not everyone. But once again, this law was upheld by the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court said, yes, it is legal to intentionally discriminate against one group of people. So we really have this pattern, and we're going to see it throughout the course for my students, is that while the Supreme Court does uphold a lot of laws that are constitutional, it does, in fact, make mistakes, and it does, in fact, uphold laws which are blatantly unconstitutional when we look back at it. So not only do we have all of these issues, but in the South in particular, we have disenfranchisement of black voters. In this cartoon here, we have this real hope after the Civil War that we have freed slaves that are going to be able to participate in the economy, to earn a living wage, to participate in politics. And in fact, what happens in the South in particular is disenfranchisement of black voters are made it difficult to vote for them with poll taxes, with literacy tests. And even though legally you had voting rights for men in the United States, if you're a black man, it's much harder to vote, and even more harder to become an elected official. We start seeing with the growth of these cities, we have this huge divide between the urban Americans and the rural Americans. And the final debate for this election was something known as the free silver debate. So farmers, as I mentioned, were in debt. They owed money. The financial panic of 1893 didn't help. And their hope was that if there was more silver, if there were more coins, if there were more currency, then it would create inflation. And inflation is when the cost of goods rises. And if you're thinking, why would they want inflation? Well, farmers are selling goods. So if the cost of their goods rise, then it's going to be easier for them to repay their debt. All right, so the election itself, we have these divides. We have America very divided in 1896. So we have the first main candidate we have here is William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan really captivates the hearts of the Democrats. He gives one of the most famous speeches in American history called the Cross of Gold speech. My students, you will be checking it out in class this week. And he really takes this idea of free silver and the plight of farmers in the West and uses that as his main platform. And he's a populist. So there's another party at this time, the Populist Party. And while he himself is nominated by the Democrats, the Populist Party, which is another major party and had just really been created particularly with the thoughts of the farmers in mind, they decide to nominate him as their candidate as well. So he's actually nominated by two parties as the person that they are backing. And since he is more of a candidate of the West, he spends his campaign riding around on the railroad. So Bryan travels all around the United States, giving speeches, thousands of speeches, often at the back of a train car, but he really travels around trying to speak to the average person and explain to them how he will help them. Now, he is contrasted against, not contrasted, I guess he is contrasted against William McKinley, who is running for the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is also in the midst of a big shift right now, and so is the Democrats. So just to go back, Bryan is running as a Democrat. The Democrats were in charge in the financial panic of 1893. So they're already kind of at a disadvantage in this election. Voters blame the Democrats for this panic. So McKinley comes in really as the hope that Democrats can say, hey, it was our fault, we messed things up, but we're bringing someone new in, and he's going to change things. So Democrats are really trying to hope that people will see that they made a mistake and they recognize that and they want to do things better. Republicans, on the other hand, very much want to blame the Democrats for that financial panic and present a position of power, of stability that say we're going to settle things down and make things better. They want to put a protective tariff in so to make the price of goods that are coming from overseas more expensive, to protect American businesses. They're actually pro-immigrant because they recognize the need for labor to have more immigrants. Whereas the Democrats are in fact anti-immigrant. They play off of those fears that immigrants are going to hurt jobs. So the Republicans say we're going to focus on the urban centers, we're going to focus on the cities, we're going to say we're going to help the workers, whereas really the focus for the Republicans was very much business. They knew they needed businesses to support their election hopes. And this is really the first modern campaign. And it's the first modern campaign in that the Republicans for McKinley raised $4 million in 1896. In today's money, it's over $123 million. So a tremendous amount of money were coming into this election. And before this election, it was really just individual donors. It was people supporting a candidate or another. Whereas in this election, McKinley's campaign manager went around and talked to business owners and said, how much would you want and be willing to pay to prevent this anti-business Bryan from winning the election? How much does McKinley winning cost to you? And businesses donated in kind. So McKinley very much sat back, physically as well as literally. He sat on his porch. People came to him. So he sat there and gave speeches from his porch while Bryan traveled around America on a train. And McKinley talked about the issues that really he believed that the people that worked in factories, the people that lived in cities, the people that lived in the East Coast cared about. And in the end, the urban centers won. So we have this sharp divide, however. If you look at this map, we have a united front in New England, in the Midwest, where we have a lot of these factories, whereas in the South and in the Western states, we have huge support for the Democrats. So this is a real divisive campaign between these two individuals, and it has a huge impact on the United States. Number one, modern campaigns very much come from this campaign. The amount of money that's put into this signifies really a start of a race to raise more and more money and spend more and more cash. Big business suddenly really shows its might, its power. The election of McKinley really emboldens them to continue donating money, to continue influencing politics. Here's a very famous cartoon on the right that shows Congress, but all these businesses behind it that are influencing the actions of our representatives. The Populist Party really never had a level of success that they had with Bryan and before that again. So you see really that party decline. Bryan does run for president 2 more times after this. He does not win, but he does run for president 3 times. And it does show this urban dominance, that cities really have a great deal of political power, in many ways more than the rural areas. And it shows and starts a level of Republican dominance that continues for about 30 years. There is a bit of a break in there right before World War I, where the sins of the businesses are so large that you have this kind of progressive pushback, and we'll get into that next week, my students. But Republicans really do become focused on business, on industry, and national government. Up until this point, Republicans really had been trying to do a lot of other programs and promote other issues. Republicans were really trying to help freed slaves get a head start in life. We're trying to work against disenfranchisement. And this is really a turning point for the Republican Party of moving away from this free soil, really helping a lot of people, to a much more business-oriented party that we still see today. So, election of 1896, very important election as we turn into the 20th century. And in class, my students, we're going to be looking at some other elements of our society at the time, particularly the automobile, which really helped transform the United States into something that we might recognize a bit more of today. All right, turning point number 1 is over. Next week, we'll be looking at turning point number 2, which is World War I. All right, we'll see you then.